GP as well. I want to welcome you today to our presentation on vitamin D levels, why it's important for us. And there's been a lot in the press recently regarding COVID and improving our vitamin D levels. It's just an overview as to why it's important to have vitamin D levels checked, how our genes influence them, and see how vitamin D impacts on our daily lives. So the topics that I want to go through today is, what is vitamin D and why is it useful? Where do we get it from? How does it affect our bone health, our immune system? How do our genes play a part in the vitamin D process? What are the complications from a prolonged vitamin D deficiency? And what should our levels be? How we can get them checked? So vitamin D is a nutrient which we either produce or consume, and I'll go into the next slide to explain how we do that. And it's converted into an active form from our body. So when we produce the vitamin D ourselves or consume it, it's in an inactive form, and therefore we need to change the way it's structured so that it becomes a bit more of a useful product for us. And in actual fact, in its active form, it becomes a hormone. And hormone is a chemical messenger throughout the body which regulates a bodily system. And we know, and I'll go on to explain, how it interferes with bone health, how it impacts our immune system. But there's also been other research suggesting that low vitamin D levels have been associated with a reduction in the secretion of insulin. Insulin, an important hormone which plays a part in glucose control, and therefore if we have a lack of insulin, we are at risk of getting diabetes. In terms of vitamin D and DNA, when we do replicate our own body cells, there's usually a quality control measure to stop any abnormal cells getting through, and it's thought that vitamin D plays a part in that. And so a low vitamin D level or levels has been shown to potentially increase the risk of certain cancers. It's involved in wound healing, lung development, so the air sacs in our lungs from birth. Some research has shown that vitamin D actually helps to develop that process, and any liver cells that get damaged, it helps with the regeneration of those liver cells. So there's quite a few other aspects that vitamin D could potentially have an important role for. So where do we get our vitamin D from? So primary source, the sun, and where there's a chemical reaction from the UVB rays on our skin, which turns a certain form of cholesterol into the inactive vitamin D3, and certain foods. So you've got fish like mackerel, egg yolks, red meat, fish oils, all very high, rich in vitamin D. And as we consume it, it's in its inactive form. So how does vitamin D play a part in achieving optimum bone health? Well, to have healthy bones, we know we need calcium and phosphorus. Calcium and phosphorus, two components which help the development of bones and maintaining healthy teeth. They have other functions as well, calcium being helping with clotting, helping with muscle contraction, and regulating a normal heart rhythm, and phosphorus can help turn fat and carbohydrates into energy. But in terms of bone health, you need both to have a good structure to the bones. What vitamin D does, it not only helps to regulate the amount of calcium and phosphate in the body, but it actually helps the body to absorb the calcium. So some studies have shown that even if you have really good levels of calcium, the bones are not able to absorb it as well without vitamin D. It's the bridge that helps calcium get absorbed by bones. So you need both together. You need a good amount of calcium and a good amount of vitamin D and phosphorus to actually allow the bones to absorb all that nutrition. So this is a diagram which shows the process of how we turn vitamin D in its inactive form to its active form. So first of all, the sunlight hits our skin, the UVB rays, and there's a type of cholesterol that lives in our skin, and that reaction produces the first component of an inactive vitamin D3 molecule. It's then passed on to the liver, which changes it into a secondary form of inactive vitamin D called 25-hydroxy D3, and then finally it's converted by the kidney to the active form, which is 125-hydroxy D3. And similarly for food, we absorb the inactive vitamin D3 from our food. It's then sent to the liver to go through the same process. And what the active vitamin D does, it allows increased absorption of calcium from the food we eat into our bloodstream, and it also helps the bones to absorb all that excess calcium. You'll see this on the bottom left hand side. There's a structure with the thyroid and the parathyroid glands. They're involved separately in the process, and they are involved in a way where if you have low calcium levels in the blood, the body detects that and stimulates the parathyroid glands, which sit in the neck, to produce a parathyroid hormone, which then stimulates the kidneys to convert more of the inactive vitamin D to an active form. So moving on to the immune system. So in our immune system, certain cells actually have vitamin D receptors called VDRs, and vitamin D impacts on both areas of our immune system. So we have the innate immune response. Innate immune response is what we are born with, so it's our defense system from birth. The adaptive immune response is the defense system we acquire. So when we get colds, viruses, infections, our body learns about those particular organisms and how to deal with those. So you've got the innate and the immune response. What vitamin D does with the innate immune system, it can actually reduce inflammation when the vitamin D molecule connects to these receptors, and it can also trigger certain chemicals to be produced by the immune cells, and they literally puncture the bacteria and cause them to die off. So it helps with fighting off infections. With the adaptive immune system, interestingly, with certain cells called T cells and B cells, which are part of our immune system that help to fight off infections, it actually stops the T cells and B cells dividing and actually reduces the amount of antibody they produce. Well, one might say, hang on a second, we're trying to fight off an infection. Vitamin D here is trying to hamper the process. Which is actually not the case. It's the vitamin D actually kicks in once the body has developed a good response to the infection. So what the vitamin D is actually doing is putting a tap on the immune system to stop it overexerting itself, and therefore, reduce the chance of conditions where one might have an overactive immune system, and that confuses the immune system to thinking some healthy cells are actually unhealthy cells. So autoimmune conditions such as psoriasis, things like that, they actually use vitamin D synthetic analogues as part of the treatment to try and help manage the conditions better. So not only does vitamin D help our innate immune response, the defense system from birth, to fight off infections, it stops it getting out of control and over exaggerating the reaction. So vitamin D and our genes. So our genes are involved in producing the enzymes that convert vitamin D into its active form. So the diagram that I showed earlier, where the inactive vitamin D is passed on to the liver and then the kidney and is converted to the active form, there are several enzymes involved in that process, and our genes help to make those enzymes or express the proteins to make those enzymes. Some studies have actually shown that vitamin D can actually impact to 200 of gene expression. The gene expression is an instruction to write a certain protein, and sometimes we have variants within the gene that produces the vitamin D receptor. So on the diagram on the left, towards the bottom, you can see the vitamin D particle has a snug fit within the vitamin D receptor, and that produces a very, very good reaction and a response for that immune cell or whatever cell that's using the vitamin D receptor to operate properly. However, on the right hand side, there is a slight disruption in the gene which causes a variant of the vitamin D receptor to form, and therefore the vitamin D does not really sit well within that receptor, and therefore the response is not as great. And so we might have really good levels of vitamin D sometimes, but because of these variants, we may not be making the most of it. So what are the risk factors for vitamin D deficiency? So back in 2008 to 2012, they did a 4-year study on the UK population where they looked at all age groups from 18 to 64 and 65 and above. And what they found that was 21% of the younger adults had a severe vitamin D deficiency, and over 65, 23% had a severe vitamin D deficiency. Now, if we broke that down into just the winter months, the level of vitamin D deficiencies rise in both age groups. So in the younger adult population, it increased to 40% from 20%, and in the older adult population, it increased from 20% to 30%. So those individuals who are prone to vitamin D deficiency are those who are aged over 65. This is probably due to mobility issues. They're not outside as much and therefore less exposure to the sun, having low or no exposure to the sun. So I know there's been a lot of heat waves recently and we've had plenty of sunlight, but traditionally in the normal years, we actually get exposed to very little sunlight, and including in our work environments, they're usually office-based, and artificial lighting is the main form of lighting we're exposed to, and then therefore, we get an increased risk of vitamin D deficiency forming, having darker skin pigmentation because the UVB is unable to penetrate as well into the top layer of the skin, and hence you're more at risk of not being able to produce the inactive form of vitamin D. Absorption of vitamin D. So if you have a stomach disorder or malabsorption disorder where you can't really absorb all the nutrients that you consume, or following weight loss surgery because you're consuming a lot less nutrients, that can also impact vitamin D levels. As we went through earlier, liver disease, the liver and the kidneys are involved in part of the process of converting the inactive form to the active form. And so if there is any severe liver disease or severe chronic kidney disease, that can also impact our ability to produce enough active vitamin D. Certain medications, pregnancy, obesity and breastfeeding have also been associated with a reduction in vitamin D levels. So what are the signs and symptoms? Well, they're quite vague actually. General tiredness, vague aches, and pains, general sense of not well-being, generalized weakness in muscles, especially. Bone pain can be any bone really in the body, but specifically it's more the lower back, hips, pelvis, thighs and feet where it's felt usually first. Cramps in certain situations, and really rarely seizures. So what are the complications of vitamin D deficiency? Well, if it goes on for too long in children, it can form a disease called rickets, where the bones become very soft, weak, and they can start to deform. And because they're not growing properly, it can impair their growth and therefore not reach their potential in life in terms of height. Osteomalacia is a condition where prolonged vitamin D deficiencies result in the bones becoming softer and weaker, and if that is not treated or reversed, osteoporosis can settle in, which is a disease where it's not only soft, weak bones, but actually the structure of the bone and the density of the bone is a lot worse, and that can increase the risk of something called fragility fractures. Fragility fractures are fractures caused by injuries where one would not expect a fracture to occur. So it might be a very innocuous injury, looks as if though it might just be turned into a bruise or something along those lines, but in actual fact it's resulted in the fracture, and that is because the bone density is so low. It's so low that it often results in, an injury which causes a disastrous, fracture sometimes, such as a hip fracture in elderly patients when they fall over. There's also debate regarding the role of vitamin D in non-musculoskeletal conditions. So as we mentioned before, we feel that sometimes vitamin D plays a part in autoimmune diseases, cancers because of that quality control pathway, sometimes mental health symptoms. So low vitamin D levels have been associated with low mood as well, and cardiovascular diseases. But a lot more research is needed to see whether they actually are affected by low vitamin D levels. So what are the optimal vitamin D levels? How can we check them? And what can we do about them when they are low? So an optimal level is between 50 and 150 nanomoles per litre. And if insufficiency is between 25 and 50, so when you are in the insufficient category, all that requires is supplementation, which is widely available through pharmacies or supermarkets, where the vitamins that you can buy do contain a small amount of vitamin D, and that should bump you back up into normal range. However, with deficiencies, because your levels are so low, it will take you an absolute age to get back into the normal range. So therefore, a higher strength treatment is usually needed, which is often prescribed by your GP. And how we detect vitamin D levels is a blood test, so they're widely available. So you can have vitamin D levels through ToHealth, through your GP, and so forth. And it's a very easy test to do. So what are the takeaway messages from today? I hope you found this presentation useful, and it's improved your knowledge about vitamin D and how it's important, especially in the UK, to have vitamin levels checked. Main sources of vitamin D come from sunlight and certain foods, so fish oils, red meat, and those sort of food products. It's important in improving our bone strength. With calcium and phosphorus, it allows calcium to be absorbed not only from our intestines, but also from the calcium going into the bone structure itself. It plays a role in our immune system, it helps fight off infections and helps prevent autoimmune diseases potentially. Variants in our genes can affect how effectively we use the vitamin D that is available to us. Prolonged vitamin D deficiencies can lead to quite serious health complications if not corrected quickly, and they may also play a role in other non-musculoskeletal conditions, but more research is really needed before that is truly recommended in terms of treatment for all these other health problems. Thank you very much for joining me today, and I hope you have a lovely rest of the day.